everyone. Welcome to the Christ Pearls channel. This is Jessica. He is risen. And today I have my friend Rachel here from Women and Priesthood. Rachel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Jessica. He is risen. My name is Rachel. I'm from the Women Priesthood channel, and Jessica and I are like kindred spirits. We met each other at the Book of Mormon Evidence Conference and couldn't stop talking. And even though we live on opposite sides of the United States, you know, we keep in touch and keep collaborating.
I have to connect with people who are like kindred spirits because they are like hard to find. Okay, they're like a needle in a haystack. So
Jessica and I both have like a really positive experience and perspective about how lucky we feel to be women who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it's really nice to kind of speak for a younger audience to some extent, younger-ish, and say like, you know, I know that there are women out there who maybe have a personal experience or interpretation of the gospel being oppressive to women. We have the exact opposite experience where we really feel lucky to be members of this church while this gospel is being restored and just a celebration. So, you know, we wanted to kind of highlight and celebrate Jesus Christ's relationship to women and how special he saw women. And Jessica's put an enormous amount of work into this presentation and research. Like it's so beautiful. If you don't tear up, you don't have feelings.
Exactly. So we're gonna talk ladies and their status with Jesus Christ. So one thing that kind of inspired this is we had seen the new announcement by the First Presidency about Easter, and there was just this really huge emphasis by the First Presidency to make Easter as important or more important than Christmas, and then also to just understand that there wouldn't be a Christmas without Easter, because unless Jesus Christ had completed that atonement and was resurrected, he would just be another baby that was born that would be forgotten. But he's not. He's our Savior, and it's because of what happened at Easter that we should be focusing on the Lord during that time. And so they were encouraging us in the church to lead out in the world by establishing traditions that had to do with Easter, and also to just focus more on the resurrection of Jesus Christ for this holiday. And so you'll have to go check out his message, but it's on Instagram. He has it on YouTube. It's on the church website, which is what I have pulled up right here. And that's kind of what inspired this feeling that we should think a little bit more about Easter. And then when I started looking at this on my own, I was very inspired by the women of Easter. So we may have to do this in two parts. This is actually a lot of slides, but we have this little presentation that I put together. So me and Rachel are going to comment on it and share it with you all. So let's go. Let's see here. So this is our presentation. We're going to look at women in the first century era of Palestine, and we're going to kind of get an idea of what life might have been like for them so that we can understand the context of some of these stories about people like Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany. There's like 7 Marys, and I've put together just a little bit of information about all of them. And the two that I really am excited to talk about is actually Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany. So life for these women, according to the majority scholar opinion, would have been one that in our day we might look at as very oppressive to women. So the consensus scholarly opinions regarding the status and daily life of Jewish women in first century Palestine is that the status of women was largely defined by patriarchal norms, limiting their freedoms and opportunities, while there was some variation in how these expectations were applied, especially based on socioeconomic status. The general cultural framework restricted women's roles to domestic life with few legal or educational privileges. And then the following slides are going to summarize this scholarship. So a few bullet points would be right here. So the broader kind of Greco-Roman world and the Jewish society together was very patriarchal, and women were expected to remain like largely unseen. Like they could come out in public to do their economic duties, and then marriage was important. Fathers would essentially take responsibility for their daughters until the time that they were married. But in some cases, a father could actually sell his daughter into slavery. And so these are some of those things that make people think, well, that's really oppressive. And like it kind of makes you cringe a little bit to think about a father selling his daughter. And then with regard to marriage, there usually were dowries put in place so that a woman could inherit something from her father that she would take into her marriage, and it would be considered sole and like separate property of hers that her husband couldn't necessarily take. It was for her protection. So in some ways there were some legal protections there, but other than that, they really didn't have a lot of legal rights. A woman couldn't be a witness in court. And so the fact that Jesus appeared to a woman first when he was resurrected is a little bit of a departure from the norm, because she couldn't necessarily testify and have her testimony be taken seriously in that type of society. So a couple of other things that the scholarship sort of summarizes is that, women couldn't hold public office. I just talked about their testimony. And also, this was another thing. So their public interactions with men were really strictly controlled. And this kind of gives you a little bit more insight on the women taken into adultery, because there's just this idea there that if a woman, for example, even looked at a man a certain way, somebody could make an accusation against her. So these are some really just kind of interesting things that I had noted while I was digging into, okay, what was life like for women in Jesus's day? Women were expected to focus on housework, child rearing, obedience to their husbands. They had legal and societal status that was tied to their husband and his reputation, his wealth. And widows were often very severely economically, I guess you could say, like downsized. It's like as soon as their husband died, they would lose all of their status. And so that's why you see, I think, an emphasis in the gospel where Jesus talks a lot about widows and caring for the widows. And it changes that story for me a little bit of the widow's mite. And then sons were favored over daughters. So sons, and I thought this was a little disturbing, but I found some scholarship where they had researched and found that it seemed as if there was this idea that sons would be given better nourishment. So for example, if a woman had a baby girl and then a year later she has a baby boy, she would stop nursing the baby girl just to nurse the baby boy to make sure that he got all of his nutrition and things like that. So there was also this strict seclusion of women that was just more feasible for wealthy women, but the lower class women, you could tell like classes, because they would be out in public more than a wealthy woman. So those are some of the things that kind of help us understand what life was like back then for women. They did have a lot of religious participation in their lives. So for example, even though the religion was also generally male dominated, they had participated in sacrifices and religious rituals and festivals and feasts and things like that. So they did have a pretty active, I guess, religious social life from everything that I was able to gather. But there's one scholarly opinion that I found that I really appreciated. It's by Carol Myers. She was quoted in a BYU research paper by another girl named Carol. So it gets a little confusing, but her opinion is that women were a vital, intricate part of the fabric of ancient life. And she doesn't take the view that they were necessarily oppressed. So most scholars concur with the opinion that women of the ancient Near East were oppressed, holding a viewpoint that male dominance in a society inevitably indicates female inferiority and subservience, but this might not be completely accurate, especially judging by the standards of the time and region. So as one BYU researcher noted in a paper featuring the opinion of a scholar named Carol Myers, who offers a different perspective of the nature of relationships in the ancient world, in Myers' opinion, women were a vital, intricate part of the fabric of ancient life. And she goes on to explain how they end up looking at different regions around the world. And she found that in the Hebrew society, there were actually many protections for women written into their laws. And you can see this in the book of Deuteronomy. And so I don't know if that kind of helps paint a little bit of a picture, but for example,
can I offer just a little insight?
Yeah.
Like, Jessica and I had chatted about this before. So a couple things about Jewish law that I think is interesting is I'm pretty sure, don't they trace the lineage of children through the mother's genetic line. So in
Yes.
many ways, it actually is a matriarchal society in some ways, because your lineage is actually traced to the woman's bloodline. But also, my background was in Middle Eastern studies and Arabic in college, and then I went and worked in the Middle East. So I lived in Morocco, and then I lived in Dubai, and then I lived in Baghdad. And I will tell you that the first time I ever saw a real desert, like a real desert, it was the quietest, it's the most silent place and the most terrifying place you've ever been, because you look at this desert and you're like, how could anyone survive this? Like like the landscape is literally trying to kill you. And so I think that's something that where we kind of apply our own context onto the way that they lived. I don't think people really truly appreciate how much people in a tribal society, so basically everyone in the Bible and Book of Mormon,
Yeah.
was trying to literally survival was so like that's success. If you can actually protect your family, nourish your family, and then have a next generation, you have succeeded. And that is an enormous effort. So it's interesting when people are just trying to survive. It's when the concept of a tribe and tribalism actually makes a lot of sense, and why you're either part of the group, you're cohesive, you're sticking together, and you're working for survival, or you die. And when those are the stakes, I just feel like that changes the way that you might look at things when
Well,
you
I
look
think
at
I
them.
think that is what was happening here. I mean, they were developing laws that essentially create like a protection for women and children. So if you think about like a father's role being to provide a home and a safe place for his family where his children can be raised, the laws in the society reflect that being a priority. And I think that's the thing that Carol pointed out that I thought maybe some of the other scholars overlooked, like they just
Mhm.
didn't look at it that way from that perspective. So for example, this is a quote that she has. So it was a BYU research paper by Carol Pratt Bradley, and she's quoting Carol Myers, who Carol Myers is the one who warns against judging ancient history by modern assumptions and standards. And she says the following: just as the family was inextricably connected with its land holdings, so too were individual family members economically and psychologically embedded in the domestic group. In the merging of the self with family, one can observe a collective group-oriented mindset with the welfare in the individual inseparable form, that of the living group. In assessing the participation of adult women in family labor, it's important to avoid the trap of looking at female household work as somehow less important than male tasks. Both males and females worked in the household. The boundaries of a woman's world were virtually the same as those of a man's in early Israel. Men's and women's labors together were marked by their interdependence. And I really like this because, so kind of offline, Rachel and I were talking, and I was giving her a little bit of a backstory on myself. And I was a single mom for 12 years with a little girl. And I explained how I had moved out in the middle of my senior year of high school. And this was just because of like my family situation, and didn't really have like financial help or support from my parents, and so it was really hard. And so when I was studying this concept of like what life was like for women in the ancient Near East, and I had come across this paper, I studied the paper. I actually read the whole paper on my channel in like this raw video early on, because it's really good, it's
What's the
informative.
name what's the name of that video?
So if you go to a playlist that I have, I think it's the Hebrew wedding tradition playlist, that's the raw version. It's literally me researching this
We need to
subject.
link that. I think that's a must watch for
And
everybody.
then the actual marriage motif series, so I have another one that is what came out of that original research. So I ended up taking all that research, compiling it into like a more slideshow format presentation, and then just sharing all of those concepts that I was able to gather in the research. So I have both, like the raw is raw, and then the other one is just like a slide presentation. So if that interests you guys, it is a really good paper. You can find it on the BYU research archive, and I can put the link in the description of this video for this paper. But essentially what she points out is that marriage and family was at the core of not just their societal values, but their religious beliefs. So if you think about like a Zion community, it's going to be centered on marriage and family and making sure that families work. And I think that the lesson that I was able to pull from that is I was able to see how the work that the church is doing truly is supportive of the family. The church is the vehicle in terms of providing ordinances and getting us onto that covenant path, but then it's also the scaffolding in support of building that righteous family. And essentially, the government of God is that family patriarchal government where we have a father and a mother working together to rear children. And I think that was my biggest takeaway from this study. So I don't know if you have comments on that.
I think what's so interesting too about that word of interdependence is like it's such a bad word right now, and it's such a bad it's more like independence is celebrated, especially in women's circles. And I was reading the Pew Research Institute, which I think does some of the best like studies on United States behavior trends and things like that. And it's crazy how many, 10 years ago, it was like, oh, kids aren't, young people aren't having families and getting married as young anymore. And now it's literally like the number of single people who have no desire to cohabitate or get married or have children is at an unprecedented high. And we have the largest demographic of women in the United States who are single, who don't ever plan to be with a partner. And we've never had that much independence in the United States. What a surprise. So it's interesting that conditions now, we don't live in a desert, right?
Mm-hmm.
Conditions now are such that you don't have to be interdependent to survive, but do you? Because if you aren't interdependent, you're not going to have posterity. More than just having babies, it's going to be very hard to have a family where you can actually teach values that are sustained over time. Now, I'm not like my mom's from a single mother, my husband's from a single mother. Like the work that single mothers or single fathers do is phenomenal. And I think the gospel teaches us like it's never too late. There's never an end. You can always have good relationships, but the celebration of independence, especially among women, I really see it around women. I don't know, is it such a good thing? Because interdependence resulted in strong societies. Independence just results in a lot of individualistic people.
I think it's part of why we see a lot of, I think it's why we see a lot of like narcissism and just kind of this trending into this, I don't know, it's like when it talks about like the latter days being like the days of Noah, I look around all the time and I'm like, how are we not there already? Because I see things where, I mean, just think about all the bad things in the world, okay, for a second. Like child trafficking, just pornography is like pervasive. Like you can't even get away from it no matter how hard you try. Like you really do have to teach your kids like how to avoid it as much as possible because they're gonna run into it at a young age. And so there's all these like things happening. And I feel like this comes out of exactly what you just said, that we're no longer interdependent. It's all about me. We're independent. And so we can just do whatever we want. And it doesn't matter who we hurt or who is affected by our choices. Whereas this society, we're talking about an interdependent, interconnected society where they're thinking about the family. They're thinking about in the society, how do we support the family so that people have stability and a sense of being dependent and responsible for someone more than just themselves.
I was thinking of the scripture that talks about in the last days, men will be lovers of their own selves, right? That scripture comes to my mind all the time when I think about women. I'm like, it's really celebrated. We're kind of, you and me, we're like the Sex and the City generation to some extent. Like that show was defining for like a new way of thinking about how to go about growing up and becoming the kind of woman you wanted to be. It was financial independence. It was sexual independence, right? And it's interesting because nobody likes the Sex and the City sequel right now, the reunion. No one likes it. And it's because it doesn't look so great when you're like 70 and you have never invested in I'm being very harsh. Like I did enjoy those shows at times, but like it doesn't look so great when you actually see the arc of someone who has spent their entire lives investing in themselves.
Yeah,
They haven't
exactly.
invested in another person, a great love, hopefully, fingers crossed, right? Children, grandchildren, a community, like, you know,
Well, and you know what? Another thing that's kind of interesting that you bring up that scripture. So I always think of, so like, for example, this word interdependence, right? So earlier we were talking about how you were talking about the desert and how it's so harsh. There's like these harsh desert conditions. And, we kind of had to be a little bit interdependent just for survival physically. And I think something that's interesting about that is you think about the shift, like, just in the world that we live in, going back to our modern conveniences, how things are easier. We don't necessarily need to be interdependent for survival, like physical survival, but we do for spiritual survival. And I
ooh,
think that's what's interesting, because think about the concept of the desert and the symbolism of the desert. So for example, there were two exoduses. There was the one in Moses's day where they traveled across the Red Sea and wandered in the desert for 40 years. There's the one in modern church history where we literally go from Palmyra out to the desert of Utah, and Utah is like the upside down version of Israel. And so there's all this like symbolism there that I think we did have a modern exodus. I mean, President Nelson, he wrote that he did like a BYU speech. They ended up publishing it in the church magazines called The Exodus Repeated, where he points out how we do have a modern exodus in Israel's history. And so then you look at like Revelation chapter 12, for example, and you can see how there's this story there of going, like the gospel being taken into the desert. It's talking about at the time of Christ. I mean, technically it's talking about the premortal, the time of Christ, and the last days all at the same time. But that's because there's a parallel there. There's something that's repeating in history. Cycles are repeating. And one of these cycles is this concept of having to flee into the desert to survive spiritually.
mm,
And I think that's interesting because in some ways, we have this benefit of being able to like pick up our phone, for example, and we have like a whole giant gospel library at our fingertips that people before would never have had access to. So the gospel was told in preaching and oral tradition. I mean, some people couldn't even read. So there's like these benefits that we have to be able to have all of this like knowledge at our fingertips, but without that physical interdependence on each other, we can actually digress so far spiritually that we become exactly what you were describing, lovers of our own selves instead of lovers of God. And so that physical interdependence almost like necessitates a greater spiritual interdependence. And I think that now we have the opposite. We have a challenge where we have so much ease and luxury that we're not physically interdependent so much as maybe in times past, but that can actually affect our spiritual interdependence on God if we're not careful. And so, like, we need to seek, I think, for that spiritual learning and understanding. And that's actually one of the things President Oaks just talked about in that First Presidency message, that we need to study the gospel as part of our Easter tradition. And maybe there's something to that concept of really diving deep, studying, learning this history, knowing the gospel, so that as we are experiencing luxury, we can still remember that we need to be interdependent spiritually. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of turning our hearts to the fathers and the fathers to the children. It's interdependence for our spiritual progression and survival. They cannot be saved without us. We cannot be saved without them. And so I think that concept of interdependence, you can see it like baked into this ancient society, but it's a spiritual concept more than it is like a survival concept.
that is a beautiful principle. I'd never thought about the idea of like heightened spiritual interdependence to replace what used to be like a very logistical, just survival interdependence. And that was you said that was Russell M. Nelson's second Exodus talk.
It's called The Exodus Repeated.
So good. I'm gonna have to.
Yeah,
We have
you're
so
gonna.
many references for this video.
I'll try to find the link for that one too. I actually refer back to that one a lot. I've mentioned it a lot on my channel just because I do think that there's two exoduses that have happened. In fact, I had linked it. I know this is going to sound super like new agey, but I noticed those eclipses that went over the United States and made the X mark. they repeat again over the Red Sea in
Huh.
2027 and
Oh my
2034.
gosh. I'm
And
like,
it totally made me think of like the two exoduses that took
huh,
place on two promised lands.
huh.
And I was like, I feel like God is
Oh,
putting a sign in the heavens and the earth for us to remember these two exoduses and almost like to remember our identity, like who we are. We're Israel.
so good.
So that was what it kind of made me think of when I read that talk by President Nelson. And anyway, it's a good one. We'll have
Yeah.
to put that in the link too. So kind of like moving along with this idea, so she pointed out how scholars often comment on the isolation of women within the confines of their own homes as being this like oppressive kind of tyranny that women were enduring. And she actually refutes this notion. She says women were hardly a segregated or isolated subset of the family household, and meshed as they were in the larger kinship community, the activities of the household members were hardly contained by the family household. The spheres of activity of a family household transcended its own persons and property. The affairs of household thus took on a public character. And so this is that concept of the family is actually the economy. And so that work that's being done in the home is part of their economic survival as well as their spiritual and religious values. And so I think that one thing that I noticed, and where I'm making a connection is I recently did a little mini video series just because the Come Follow Me this last week was about the priesthood restoration. And so I did a little mini series called Keys to the Kingdom. And it was just about the restoration of priesthood keys and the importance of that. The fact that in our religion, we do have this truth claim, and that is that we hold those keys that, like it says in Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, we're the only true and living church on the earth. And it's not to say that all other religions are not of value, but Joseph Smith talked about the parable of the wheat and the tares. And I actually have this quote that I can try to find, but he basically talks about how if you look at Matthew, the wheat and the tares parable is in there, and then Joseph Smith had actually commented on it and remarked on it. And in Doctrine and Covenants, he changed it a little bit. So he talked about how the wheat is gathered first into the garners, and then the tares are bound and burned. And that was the change that he made from the version that it is in the New Testament. And the reason why this concept of like keys comes up for me is just because the covenant path is like the way that we access God's power. But then this is all in support of the family. And I think that this concept that like just because a woman's work is mostly in the home, that somehow that means she's isolated or she's being segregated from society is that presentism lens that scholars are putting on women of the ancient world. And I'm not sure that that's actually completely true. I agree with Carol Myers that that maybe we're just looking at it too much from our perspective, and we're not thinking about maybe the fact that these people, based on their religious values and beliefs in this ancient Hebrew society, they would have seen that work in the home as the most important work. Just because they had this view that like the family needs to continue, we need to perpetuate posterity, we need to, like if you look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their wives, Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel, you'll see that they actually took action. These women took action to try to secure promised blessings that the Lord had given them. And their whole lives were focused on these prophecies about how this Savior was going to come into the world to redeem them through their posterity. And so they were doing everything in their power to make sure that that happened. They didn't just sit idly by and say, well, the Lord promised. So kind of like Nephi when he went to go get the brass plates, he didn't just sit back and say, well, the Lord said he was going to deliver Laban into my hands, so I'm just going to sit here and wait for him to deliver him. He went and took action. He acted. And I think that that's kind of like the concept of maybe priesthood power that I see for women, is that we have this ability to nurture a whole generation and create the kind of people that the Lord wants us to become. If we're trying to be a Zion people, we have to raise Zion children. And
You
that
know,
is the most important work.
I mean, I can't verify this 100%, but one of the I was the girls' camp stake counselor to a woman who was the wife of our stake president at the time that they had made the mission age change. And one of the reasons that stake presidents were told about this change happening was that they found an insanely high correlation with returned missionary women and active children. And it wasn't like there wasn't a corresponding correlation with men who'd served missions. It was if mothers had served missions in the 80s, they had a crazy high rate of active children
Well, that's
that were in the
interesting.
church. And so members of the 12 had said, this is the story that's told, we got to get more women on missions. We got to get more girls on missions because they are setting the pace. And my mom was a return missionary. She was a convert and a return missionary. And I can say, like, her mission was so defining. Like, it was defining for her. It was defining for our family, you know? Like, she kind of found her value and her worth on that mission and came home and made her family her work. And I think with great success. But yeah, I think that to that point about like the generations that are coming are so affected by the mothers and the influence that those mothers have. And then a quick story I want to tell you that changed my perspective on this. Like, I think it's fair. I remember growing up and being like, why are all these stories about men? The history books are always about men. You know what I mean? Like, and it's interesting because I had this experience in Morocco. I was living with a Muslim family, like traditional Muslim family, moderately traditional, like who would let an American girl like live with them? They're moderate, right? And what would happen because I was a girl is like when you're home and no one's at home, the girls can take off their veils. And I had some of the other boys in my college who were also in Morocco living with other families, like, what's it like? And I was like, oh my gosh, it's a party. Like, when everybody's home, like home is the life of the party. And the way that Muslim homes were structured was that there was this big, it was almost like a home, and then they took out the middle of the home and made like an interior garden. And that was the design of a lot of Arab homes in the heat, is that the family would go into private, but there would be this internal structure where the family could just hang out and the women could live their own lives. And so it's like our personal lives are actually a very robust and serious part of who we are, but because they're private, we don't necessarily write them down in history books. And so that's the way I always think about, just because these women's lives were more private doesn't mean they didn't exist, didn't mean that they weren't robust and energetic and very full of life. And honestly, probably a larger proportion of those actual people's lives than what they ended up like writing down.
I think that's interesting too, because I mean, if you think about like the scriptures, these women, some of them may have written down things, but I mean, to try to have that survive for thousands of years, I mean, we barely have like church history intact. So like, I just think that you're right. We've lost what their life was really like. And I think that what she's pointing out in this paper is that because we've lost that, we're using like our concept of what we think a woman's life would be like if it was liberated and free, and we're putting that presentism lens on the past, and that may not necessarily be accurate or true, like a true portrayal of how women felt in these days. And for me, it was just kind of an eye-opener, because I've never really been like a feminist per se, but I mean, as a single parent, I did have some, I don't know, maybe skewed perceptions of what men look like a good man.
Hmm.
And I feel like I may have like seen more patriarchy like in the church when I was a little younger, and maybe not. I never felt really bothered by it, but I mean, there's things where I could have bought into maybe some of these, I don't know, criticisms of the church at a younger age. But as an older person who's been a single parent, I cannot. I just look at that and I'm like, this is ridiculous, because I remember what it was like to be a single mother. I remember the desires of my heart. I remember the prayers that I would have. I mean, there were times where I would be on my knees at night for hours praying that I could just get through the day, because the burden that you carry is so heavy. It's like financial burdens were constantly a stressor for me. I felt sometimes like sick and depressed from the amount of stress that I was carrying. And then on top of that, I think this natural, I guess, like guilt, like the mom guilt of not being there for my daughter. Like I felt like I had to put her in, daycare, or put her in, like an after school program, just so I could like work and get through the day and then get back in a time when I could pick her up. And it felt like we were gone and apart so much. And I know that she felt lonely. I know that she experienced some hard feelings from that as she got older. And I felt in hindsight, like I wish that I could remedy that. I wish that I could reconcile that. And then you hear these things growing up. This is why I liked your channel when you started it, because I read that book by Barbara Morgan Gardner too, and the Sherry Dew Women in the Priesthood one too. And I had the same feelings that you described on your channel when you started it about that. And the reason why is because as a single mother, I felt what she describes in that book. I felt the priesthood power of women. And I'm going to tell you a story. So when I was married the first time, I was not married in the temple. I was not really like inactive from the church, but I was just kind of like maybe half in, half out, like in terms of my level of activity. I've never doubted that the church was true. I've always believed that the church was true. And there's a whole backstory to that. But I kind of struggled a little bit with keeping the commandments. I struggled with feeling kind of pulled in two different directions because half my family is like one religion, and my mom was a Latter-day Saint. My dad's family is all Catholic, and most of my friends were either not of any religion or Catholic. And so I didn't have a lot of Latter-day Saint friends. I had a few, and I loved my friends from the church, but I just sort of felt like I hadn't gotten to a place yet where I was like all in, like I could do it. I felt like I could do it. I often felt like I couldn't do it. Like I had a self-esteem problem with living the gospel. I felt like I don't know if I can do it because it's hard. I mean, it requires so much time and sacrifice and like this ability to keep the commandments that I didn't feel like I had. And so I would feel very insecure about my relationship with the Lord because I would just always feel like I was falling short. And this was a struggle for probably like a good 10 years before I finally felt like a confidence before the Lord. And so this was like a spiritual journey, but it started with this first marriage where I didn't get married in the temple. And then when we divorced and I was a single parent, I had a bishop who kept encouraging me to go to the temple and get endowed. And this wasn't a common thing back then. Usually if a girl didn't go on a mission, unless you were going on a mission or getting married in the temple, you didn't normally just get endowed. That's changed. And now the church wants women to get endowed. But back then, it just wasn't part of like the program. It just wasn't a thing. It's like some people did, but they didn't push it. Well, my bishop pushed me to do that. And I remember at the time feeling very insecure. I didn't feel necessarily worthy to go to the temple, but I felt inspired by the things that he was telling me. He talked about like a power that would come into my life. He didn't necessarily explain it the way that, Sherry Dew or Barbara Morgan Gardner did, but he recognized that you derive some power in the priesthood through each covenant that you make. And that's kind of how he explained it to me. And so I eventually did go to the temple. Now, this was a hard thing. And I remember after so I had a couple of relationships where, let me just say, I was in the bishop's office like all the time, okay, as a single parent. And it was really a struggle. And I remember feeling like there was a time where I couldn't take the sacrament. There was a time where like I literally went to my bishop and I was like, look, I need like a disciplinary council. And I was like, I feel like I'm having trouble forgiving myself for my own sins because I feel like you guys are too easy on me. And my bishop was so sweet. It was actually the one that I had when I was up in college in Utah. That was the bishop that really helped me with this. And he listened, and he had me like write all my sins down on a piece of paper and bring it to this meeting. And he was like, there's just so much about confession that people don't really like appreciate when it comes to like repentance and power in the priesthood
Mhm.
specifically.
Mhm.
But when you repent and you feel like you've done it fully, you experience a liberation, like your captive soul is free. And that is the feeling that I had. So I write it all down, and he didn't even read it. He just had me put it on the paper. I'm going to get emotional saying this, and give it to the Lord.
Wow.
And it was just so healing. It was like this real spiritual healing that I felt. And I feel like sometimes I would feel a little bit resentful and upset when I was struggling with keeping the commandments. For me, it was the law of chastity, which is huge.
For
And
everyone,
so
it's the love. You're not alone.
it's so hard. And as a single parent, you feel like lonely and sadness and like a depression, I think a lot of times, that really affects your ability in many ways to like just be more strong and like rational about like, they talk about don't, nothing good happens after midnight and all these things. And if you break those rules, you're probably going to end up in my situation. So it's true. Nothing good happens after midnight. And so it's like, this counsel that we get from our prophets and apostles is to protect us. I know that. I have a testimony of that. Looking back, I can testify to that. But at the time, I remember feeling like kind of upset that my bishop, my previous bishop in Arizona, had talked me into going to the temple and kind of had me feeling that, because I didn't know, like I always appreciated the symbolism of the temple. I didn't really struggle with that. I'm somebody who thinks symbolically, so that's something that I love about the temple. But I just felt bad. I felt guilty. Like, well, I'm not living up to those promises that I made, and it made me feel kind of like a heavier guilt and a heavier weight than I had before when I was a teenager. And so I remember feeling like, oh, I don't know if I should have went to the temple. And at the time, that was my thought. But looking back with hindsight now, as a more mature person who's been through it now, I see that that is what I needed. I see that I did derive power from going to the temple and having that eternal perspective that I needed. Because if I hadn't been to the temple, there are so many things that I didn't understand yet. And then when I did understand them, it was a motivation for me, because I started to realize that, like, nights when I would want a blessing and I couldn't have one because I didn't have a man in my home who held the priesthood who could give me a blessing. So what I would do is I would get down on my knees and I would pray to the Lord, and I would ask him to give me a blessing if I couldn't get one from like a home teacher or someone. If I could, I would. And I did have some good ones, but there were times where that wasn't an option, but I needed it, and I needed it in that moment. And there were so many times where I remember praying, and I could feel like the hands on my head, and I could feel like power in the priesthood as I prayed. And it kind of reminded me of, remember when, Joseph Smith, like, Emma's wanting a blessing and he tells her to write it down and then he'll sign it.
Oh,
Do you know that
I've never heard
story?
that story. You have to tell it. I guess that's the story.
Well, that is the story, but there's a point where she wants a blessing and she writes it down. And this kind of goes back to like section 25 of Doctrine and Covenants. But basically he tells her, just write it down, tell me what you want, and I'll sign it. And that is how I felt. Like, in the absence of the priesthood holder in my home, I felt like I could write a blessing down and I could give it to the Lord and he would bless me with it. And I had to do that so many times. I mean, I was single for 12 years. I didn't know if I was going to get married again. I wanted to, but life just works out the way it does. And all that time, I've done this like several times. Like, I can't even count the amount of times that I've had to pray and ask the Lord to give me a blessing. And he did. He did. And I felt like that is how I got through this like 12-year trial. And then I got to a place spiritually where I finally felt strong. And I mean, there was like 4 years where I didn't even date anymore. I was just like done with it. And I didn't even know if I wanted to, because I was like feeling like a spiritual high. I think I was in a ward where like President Nelson used to come to our ward, and I was friends with his granddaughter. We were in the primary presidency together, and we used to go out and visit people all the time. And I was kind of on a spiritual high at that point, because I just felt like, okay, life is good. I was feeling what it described, this interdependence with my relationship with the Lord and with the church. And that support system of having that interdependent relationship with God and with the church is what helped me be strong and get to a place where I was then ready for marriage, like a real celestial type of marriage that I wasn't ready for before. And so,
well, I think what's really interesting about what you said and what I think Barbara Morgan Gardner's book really did change the conversation and help direct our focus as women, because it was like that book was published. My working theory, like Rachel speaking, is that book, and Barbara Morgan Gardner says, like, she had members of the Quorum of the 12 like read the book, and if there were any questions about if it was doctrinally accurate, she just took it out. Like, the notes are all prophets. It's prophetic. It's based on prophetic insight. And that book really makes the argument that, like, priesthood power, yes, is for us to, administer the church functions, but its true, real, eternal purpose is to infuse our relationships and our families with power, to survive, to teach our kids the gospel, to recover. And when you, like, that's why, like, it's so interesting when you go to the temple and you continue to have, like, I'm 30 some years old when I finally had this aha. I'm like, how am I still this old, still learning new things? Like, the gospel and the priesthood power in the temple that you're taught about really emphasizes your family relationships. And I think that's where our perspective as women through, like, priesthood power through covenants, and what it's really given to us for is for the preservation of our families, whether that's your relationships, your role as a mother. Because I hear your story, and my husband was raised by a single mom. I don't know how she did it, and the burden, the strength that you would have to have. Like, and I think it's interesting too, because I feel like I gained my testimony of spiritual priesthood power in my life the year my husband was deployed to Syria fighting ISIS. I had an infant and 2 toddlers, and it was so dangerous. And I literally was just, and of course I'm dealing with postpartum. Of course, like, why, and I just remember being like, I have to acknowledge the reality that I might have to raise these kids by myself. This is so dangerous, and it was reaching that breaking point of your own capacity as a person, whatever gifts, talents, help you have, you still reach the end. And you're like, you've asked me to be a mother in the last days. I need help now. And I think that's where a knowledge of priesthood power gives you strength, that, like, God didn't set me up to fail. In fact, and that saying, where much is given, much is expected. I think it's true that where much is expected, much is given. And that's why I think we are being taught so much, men and women. We're not just being taught about priesthood power for women. We're taught about priesthood power for women and men together, like that interdependence. Like, I've started talking about Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother a lot more on my channel. I'm using direct quotes from the apostles and prophets. Like, I'm not inserting my own, but it's like, that's the point, is like the power of God is for us in our relationships. It's not about being individuals. It's about creating new life and presiding over that life together. And, the points you made up before, it's like, we're surviving just spiritually now. So
I do think spiritual survival, because think about how many times President Nelson has brought up this concept of spiritual survival, and then how many people quoted the "you will not survive spiritually" quote. Like, I think that's been quoted like 30 times. I mean, it's a big deal. And so I feel like the apostles are aware of the spiritual struggle and the power that Satan has in the earth right now. And to your point, where much is expected, much is given. And when the power of Satan increases, God has to increase his power in the earth too. And this is like a balancing act constantly of, like, how do we make sure we have the power to endure? And I love this. This is from Barbara Morgan Gardner's book. This is from the presentation that I just did on my channel called Keys to the Kingdom. And this is what we're talking about right now, Rachel. It's this idea of God's power, his total power and authority. This is how she describes it in her book. And then within that sphere, there's that portion that he delegates to humanity. Now, this is not necessarily just through the keys. And the examples she gives are Joan of Arc and she gives the example of Joan of Arc, and then I thought of a few on my own, like the founding fathers. There's people who you can see from the time that those priesthood keys were no longer in operation on the earth, we're still receiving priesthood power from God and direction from God. And Joan of Arc is somebody that Barbara Morgan Gardner likes to talk about a lot. She had done a presentation in our stake, and she mentioned the Joan of Arc story again. She also talked about it in her book. And I can see why. It's because Joan of Arc had an experience that was kind of similar to Joseph Smith, where she claimed that she saw the face of God and that he had a mission for her and that she needed to follow it. And that's essentially what Joseph Smith did too, only at the point in time where he comes into play. This is the restoration. But there are all these things that lead up to the restoration of the priesthood keys. And the reason why we need these keys is because they give us access to the ordinances of the gospel, to the covenant relationship with Jesus Christ that has said, that loving kindness, where it reminds me of the quote. I'll have to see if I can find it, but it's like, I want to say it was Brigham Young, where he talked about how that temple sealing and sealing our children, what it does is it makes it so that no matter how far off the path they stray, that at some point we're promised that they will feel the divine tentacles reaching out to pull them back. That is the covenant relationship. That is what Hesed means. It's that no matter where you go, the Savior, he's promising he's going to draw you back to him. He will do it. He can. And we give ourselves this extra power in the priesthood when we enter into this special relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, the founding fathers, they even appeared at the temple in St. George when it was built and asked for these ordinances to be done for them. And the church did do those ordinances for them. So eventually, even they needed and wanted those ordinances, but the Lord still guided them. And that's in this sphere right here. So we have that total power and authority of God. Then within that, we have this power that God gives to man. Another thing I think you can think of that doesn't necessarily have to do with the church is the fact that we have this power to procreate.
Yeah.
And that power is not going to go to everybody on the earth. Everybody will be resurrected. But the only people who will be able to continue to procreate eternally are the people who receive exaltation. So God has delegated a power to us here on the earth right now, temporarily, and we could misuse that power. We could exercise unrighteous dominion with that power, but it won't be ours if we do that.
Another thing that I think is interesting about that point is that it's so interesting how many people are choosing to not use it at all. That's what I find so interesting about the fertility studies or birth rate studies in the United States and globally. It's like we just have an unprecedented number of women and men, specifically women, who are saying, meh. Like, or I think one adversarial tool that he uses is like, it doesn't need to happen right now. You can push it down the road. Like, you can do that later. Like, you can deprioritize this. And then there's a really good documentary called is it Fertility Gap? Fertility is basically about like a category of people unplanned childlessness. So he's not saying infertility. The study is the people who thought they would be parents who aren't going to be able to because they basically procrastinated making family life a priority in their 20s or early 30s, and now they're in their 40s and they're like, I'm probably not going to have kids, and I never thought this would be me. And he does this study, it's a great around the whole globe. And I think it's so interesting how many people are choosing to not use that godly power, the ability to create life. And we used to, maybe in the 80s or 90s, they would focus on like, people having children out of wedlock as a misuse of procreative power. But now it's like people just not wanting to participate in creation at all. And that sounds like the last days to me. It sounds like people who don't want
Yeah,
to partake in godliness in any way. And that's maybe they don't
it's
see it that
true.
way, but that's a trend.
Well, that's interesting too, because I always wonder, like, how do we have like a celestial and a terrestrial kingdom? And it's like, doesn't everybody just want to be exalted? But apparently not.
It's so funny. Like, that's what I thought, but I have a really, really good friend. I won't name her name because I'll embarrass her. She's so great. She has 9 kids, 8 kids, 9 kids. And she is just so honest about how hard it is to have kids go astray, have kids to just watch her parents struggle. They had a big family, and she's like, you know what? Having a big family is really hard, and it's really heartbreaking, and it's very vulnerable, and it's like every intense emotion you could ever have. She's like, and you would think everyone would want that, but they don't. They don't. And I had never thought about it. I'm like, yeah, if you want to know what is asked of you, I don't think there's a number, but I think you're going to get a pretty good sense of those demands when you look at like a really good family, like good loving parents with like a ton of kids. That's love.
Okay, so let's go back to our slideshow presentation. We have, I think, just a couple more slides left. Maybe we can get through these really quickly, but in the church, marriage and family, this is our thing. So while exceptions existed as noted in this early scholarly debate, it seems that the general experience of Jewish women in Palestine was one of restriction from our perspective. And their primary value was seen more in child rearing, in the home. But Jesus Christ, the way that he comes in and he establishes the status of women through his interactions is what I want to get into in the next opportunity we can. I'll either do it as a presentation, or maybe Rachel, if you can come back, we'll talk about it. But I want to talk about the women of Easter, particularly the Marys. And so that's kind of where we're going with all of this. And I think just to close, let's look a little bit just on this other topic of what our views are on marriage and family. So we talked a little bit offline about this. We both have read this quote by Elder Bruce C. Hafen of the 70. He had done just a paper with his wife, Marie. And this was actually commissioned by the church. They asked them to do this and look into this passage in Genesis 3:16. And so they wrote this paper, and this is pulling from a August 2007 Liahona article entitled Crossing Thresholds and Becoming Equal Partners. And they say, correcting two extremist attitudes, the family of proclamation to the world teaches a husband-wife concept that states that fathers are to preside and to provide the necessities of life and protection for their families, while mothers are primarily responsible for the nurture of their children. Fathers and mothers are to help one another fulfill these duties as equal partners. As President Boyd K. Packer, acting president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, has said, men and women are by nature different. And while they share many basic human traits, the virtues and attributes upon which perfection and exaltation depend come more naturally to a woman. And then they go on in this same article to explain a new look and a new take on Genesis 3:16, where it says rule with. So Genesis 3:16 states that Adam is to rule over Eve, but this doesn't make Adam a dictator. A ruler can be a measuring tool that sets standards. Then Adam would live so that others may measure the rightness of their conduct by watching his. Being a ruler is not so much a privilege of power as an obligation to practice what a man preaches. Also, over in rule over uses the Hebrew bet, which means ruling with, not ruling over. If a man does exercise dominion in any degree of unrighteousness, God terminates that man's authority. And so this is really what we believe in the church. So when you hear people out there talking about how the church is so oppressive to women, and they're talking about us like we're living in first century Palestine through the consensus scholarly opinion, it's really more like what Carol Myers was saying, where you can look at things however you want. You can have a certain lens on. But if you're not looking at it through God's lens, then you're not looking at it the right way. And I think that's where the scholarship debate was happening. It's like, well, if you look at this through the lens of what the Hebrew tradition was, which is focused on God and this kind of like eternal concept of family, then you have a different perception of what a woman's life was like and what these marriage family customs and laws were really about and what they were trying to achieve. And that's true with the church today. People can look at the church, they can say, well, men hold the priesthood. And me as a single mom, I didn't have a priesthood holder in my home for 12 years. So somehow I was oppressed or deprived, but I never felt that way. I felt maybe on some level, the desire for marriage and the desire to have a priesthood holder in my home, which I have now, and I'm grateful for that, and it does make a difference. But I felt like there was compensatory power through the covenants that I made directly from the Lord. And that comes through my own faith and my own like diligence in seeking the Lord and having that interdependent relationship with him. And so I feel like when people are talking about the church in this way, they're just completely misrepresenting the truth, because this is the truth. This is what we believe. We believe that we work together, that we have interdependence on one another as husbands and wives, and on the church and on the Lord, that we're all in this together. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Oakes has an amazing talk about apostasy and restoration, and he makes this really firm. Like he says, our theology begins with heavenly parents. Our greatest aspiration is to become like them. And then he makes the point that our religion is one of families. We belong to a family religion. And I think that's well said. That I guess the point that I would make is, look at our doctrine, look at what we actually believe. And when I say doctrine, I mean like the existence of this religion, of our religion, is evidence that Jesus Christ lives. Like, Jesus Christ died and was resurrected. The Christian world believes that he rose again, but no one has ever heard from him except us. The fact that we have a religion that exists based on him visiting Joseph Smith is a testimony in and of itself that Jesus Christ lives. And I think it's amazing that what they talk about, restored truths that were lost, what was lost was the true relationship that men and women are supposed to live under, which is that men and women are equal and they're supposed to be collaborative. And we are one of the few cultures that's maintaining that norm and having kids and maintaining a high level of respect. At least that's what we aspire for,
Right.
But thank
And
you so much for
I
having
think,
me
yeah, that
on.
was so fun. And
This
I'm
was
so glad that you were
great.
able to come.
This is great. I love
So
this.
anyway, this is like our closing thought here. We don't want our LDS women to be silent partners or limited partners, but rather a contributing full partner in the priesthood. And we want to be able to think about that interdependence with Jesus Christ. And in the next video, if I do this with Rachel, well, that'd be awesome. If not, I'll do it on my own. But I want to get into, we're going to look at Jesus and the status of women and his relationship with them. So that's what we're going to be looking at next time. And I don't know. Any last thoughts?
Thank you, Jessica. This is amazing. It's so great to have you voicing these really insightful, well-researched perspectives, and I'm grateful for you.